Fantastic. I would like to introduce, welcome Professor Rybczynski to the Traditional Architecture Gathering. This is the 6th one, the 3rd online. Your beautiful book, The Story of Architecture, which is one of the most heartfelt descriptions of how these things happened that I've ever encountered. And I think everybody else will love it too. Like all books being written, I suspect that we learn more as we write than we knew before, and that it opens new windows for exploration and discovery. I think that one of the most striking and surprising things that I encountered in the last year was your question, why ornament matters. And I can't wait to hear your answer with regard to that, Professor Rybczynski. Thank you so very much for being with us. It's a real honor for us all.
Hello.
Hi, I think that we should have a tech person for every citizen and a citizen for every tech person.
You know?
Yes, yes. Thank you so much.
Let me start over. So I started with mentioning Adolf Loos, who said ornament was a crime, which is kind of the reason for this talk, because otherwise we would just take it for granted that ornament matters, and that would be that. What's important is that he said this in 1910. It's sometimes suggested that modernism really was the result of the First World War. That's clearly not true. There's a lot more going on intellectually in the world, and Loos is thinking about these things and popularizing them. And despite the fact that he wears a diamond stick pin in his cravat, he made this rather outrageous claim. As architects often do, it's outrageous to get attention. Le Corbusier said architecture was the correct and magnificent play of masses brought together in light. You notice he doesn't mention that the masses might be decorated. And when I wrote the book that Nir kindly referred to, The Story of Architecture, I realized that it was about masses in light, but it was also about many other things. And one of the things that I realized was that ornament was a very key element in the story of architecture. It wasn't what architecture was all. It's really an integral part of architecture, and it has many different uses. Some of these uses overlap, some kind of ornament covers many areas, but the first one, which John Summerson wrote about in one of his essays about architecture, is surface modulation. So for instance, if we look at this mosque in Isfahan, there's actually not much volumes in light. It's a very simple space. It's the entrance to the mosque. But in fact, it's a very rich space, and the rich space has to do with what is done to the surface, not what is done to the volumes. And it's a reminder that one of the uses of ornament is just if you have a large blank surface, and mosques didn't have windows, it's kind of boring. And so ornament is a way of simply dressing up the surface, making it interesting, making it something worth looking at. The Venetians were very influenced by Persia and all the countries of the Mediterranean because they were traders and they sailed all over the place. And when you look at the Doge's palace, try to imagine this without this kind of wallpaper. Imagine that it's just a white stucco wall. It becomes first of all, it becomes a different building, and it becomes kind of a boring building. If it were brick, maybe it's a little more interesting. But this beautiful kind of wallpaper pattern of different colored tiles is what gives a lot of character to the building. It also covers up the fact that the fenestration is so kind of all over the place. It's not a simple symmetrical organization at all. Otto Wagner in the Majolica house 300 years later in Vienna, Wagner was the developer as well as the designer. And so he was building a straightforward apartment house. You can see it's a masonry wall with windows punched in it, nothing fancy. And he's got to keep the cost down. He's not going to make a lot of extravagant things. The Viennese are not asking for balconies. So he really doesn't have a lot of opportunities for playing masses in light. And so he decorates the wall with this beautiful terracotta, glazed terracotta tiles, all these flower patterns, and what is basically a very straightforward box with windows punched in it becomes something quite extraordinary. The Viennese called it Majolica House because it looks like Majolica ware, which is the Spanish pottery. Here's another building much later in Houston by Ralph Adams Cram, the beginning of Rice University. And it's more complicated than the previous one, but Cram also decorates the surface. Instead of simply having a straightforward brick surface, he introduces, at the top, he actually introduces glazed tiles, but he also has limestone patterns, and the whole thing becomes very rich, because of the ornament and because of the architecture, but especially because of the ornament. And years later, Alan Greenberg just recently built an opera house at Rice, where he picked up some of these themes, and you can see rather straightforward box. It's the lobby, so at least he has the opportunity to have these arched windows. But he plays with different kind of brick patterns. He has some glazed tiles at the top. He doesn't have as much money as Cram did, and so it's kind of a simpler thing, but you get a lot of richness out of the ornament that he applies to the surface. There's a second type of architectural ornament that John Summerson defined, which I use his term, which is a kind of awkward term, but it's ornament that looks as if it were something else. I mean, the simplest examples are capitals. Capitals, the one on the left is an Egyptian capital, which looks like a palm, the top of a palm tree, the fronds of a palm tree. Then there's a Corinthian capital, and then the famous caryatids of the Erechtheion. The Greeks copied the idea of foliage capitals from the Egyptians, and they copied the idea of using human figures as columns. But all of these are a use of decoration to simulate something, to pretend that what we're looking at is not what we kind of first imagined, that they're leaves, but they're actually carved out of marble. It's hard to explain why this is so interesting, but Trompe-l'oeil, which exists in all cultures in one way or another, is somehow something that fascinates us. We're looking at something, we know that it's not really acanthus leaves, but in fact, that's the kind of the thrill of it, or the pleasure of looking at ornament used this way. Byzantine ornament goes much further and creates this almost the effect of lace, which is all carved marble, but carved so spectacularly that it becomes almost a layer of lace or paper or something like that. You can see that the plant forms are still there, but it's quite a different effect. In effect, and I'm stretching the definition of ornament a little bit, but everything that we're looking at on the facade of the Church of the Jesus in Rome is ornament. I mean, this is simply a masonry wall. There's none of this columns and pilasters and so on are real things. They're applied to the wall. So it's a kind of, it looks like a column, but it's not a column, or it looks like a flat column that actually supports something because there's an entablature and so on. But all these things are really illusions. And we know they're illusions, and that's what, in a sense, gives you the pleasure when you look at it. This goes, of course, much further with Art Nouveau, where everything becomes an illusion. There's wallpaper, there's columns which are sort of like Egyptian columns, but they're made out of cast iron or wrought iron, and they're stretched out, and they have these fanciful capitals at the top, which kind of sprout, and they pretend that they're banded together, but and you have again the illusion of plant shapes in the balustrade and as well as in the wallpaper. So it's looking at something which is as if it were something else. The great master of Art Nouveau in America was Louis Sullivan, And this is a department store that he designed in Louisiana. Sullivan, of course, said form follows function, which I disagree with, but I won't get into that here. But the function here was very large bays. It was a department store, so you don't want a lot of columns inside. So you ended up with a 3-story or 4-story building with 3 bays wide. And when he finished it, finished doing the facade, he realized it really wasn't very attractive, these kind of mail slots. And so he he broke it up with these vertical elements. But when you look closely, they're really like trees, and they have this beautiful foliage at the top and then some tiles. The owner of this department store was of Dutch descent and very, very proud of that. And so Sullivan created this kind of Delft tile at the top to sort of to symbolize that. There's no reason why these are trees. I mean, it has nothing to do with the department store. It's really has to do with his architectural problem and then just creating something interesting to look at. And we'll get back to that later. The Delft tile had to do with meaning because the owner of this department store was of Dutch descent. And meaning is an important use of architectural ornament, another use. It starts very early with the ancient Egyptians. So you have these great big columns in one of the funerary temples. And at the top, it's just pure decoration. There's sort of a geometrical pattern that makes it look a little more interesting. But lower down, you have the hieroglyphics, which are telling you stories, or at least telling the Egyptians, because we can't read this anymore, but they're telling you about the pharaoh. There are scenes from his life. They're probably telling you how important he was, what he did, what he accomplished, maybe battles, victories in battle, and so on. So here it's ornamenting the column, but it's also communicating a story. Of course, the Parthenon does that in a beautiful way, and you have both the pediment and the metopes of the frieze around the Parthenon, which are, of course, most of them are not there. They're in London now, which is a whole other issue. But if you're a Greek and you come to the Parthenon, you look at the building, but then the meaning of the building comes from the sculptures, from these figures that surround it on the frieze, and they decorate the building because they become things that are interesting to look at. They also told you something important about this building, which is, of course, Greek temples were not like churches. People didn't go inside them to worship. And the Parthenon was a kind of war memorial. It was a commemoration of the Greek victory over the Persians. A building much later that uses sculpture also in an important way to communicate meaning is Notre Dame, and most or all Gothic cathedrals do this. So for instance, at the top, you can see a line of statues. Those are kings of Judea, which are on the one hand, a kind of decoration, a frieze almost, but they're also figures, they're people. And most of all are the figures that decorate the entrances to the building, which are saints, sinners, heaven, hell. There's all kinds of stories here, and specific saints. They're not just generic saints. The Christians entering the church would recognize these things. And this was partly ornamental, but it was very much about communicating specific meanings. This is the Villa Barbaro by Palladio. It was a house he designed for 2 brothers. One of them was a cleric, and one of them was married and was I can't remember what exactly his job was anymore, but it was a dual house, a house for 2 brothers. And when you go into the house, it was split in 2. So the one brother had the left side, the other brother had the right side. And it seems to me that this sculpture, which one of the brothers was an amateur plaster sculptor, And that's what this is. This, in some ways, represents the two brothers holding this skull, which was a very traditional symbol of Roman architecture. There's a whole story in this pediment, in the sculpture, which is ornamenting the house, but also has meaning about the house. Very specifically, there's also a papal, I forget what you call these hats, in the middle. One of the brothers had been a papal delegate, and he was part of that court. And so there's all sorts of stories in here, and you can see the garlands underneath. I mean, some of it is pure decoration, some of it is telling you about the occupants of the house. Much later, you have, this is the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. And this is a work by Paul Cray, a great architect of the early 20th century. And Cray developed what he called a new classicism, which was a kind of stripped down classicism. His critics said it was a starved classicism, because you see these are pilasters, they're fluted, but they don't have capitals or bases. So they're a kind of a reminder or almost a shadow of a traditional classicism. Cray was trained at the Beaux-Arts. He knew and had done very traditional classical Beaux-Arts buildings, but by this point in his career, he was doing this kind of very minimalist classicism. This was a Shakespeare library. It was a collection of Shakespeare, you could say Shakespeareana, of all sorts of manuscripts, documents, books to do with Shakespeare that belonged to Folger. And Cray wanted to express this. He wanted the building to tell you that I'm a Shakespeare library. I'm not just a big building. I'm not just even a library. So he has it says underneath, Folger Shakespeare Library, but that's not really quite enough just to have the name. And the problem with architecture and meaning is architecture doesn't have a meaning. I read recently an interesting thing about music. Architecture is sometimes called frozen music. And somebody asked Toscanini, who had just played a symphony, what was the meaning of this work of music that you played? And he said the meaning is scherzo in A minor. In other words, music doesn't have meaning. You can give titles to works of music to suggest meaning, but music doesn't have meaning, neither does architecture. They're just, as Le Corbusier said, they're forms, masses in light. So how do you give meaning to a Shakespeare library? You have these bas-reliefs, each one is an indication of a Shakespeare play. This is the first part of Henry IV, and you can see Falstaff sitting in the middle and the young Henry, I think, on the left. And so and they're all different, and they're all works by an architect, a sculptor whose name I can't see because of all this junk on my screen. But the important thing is that Cray introduces meaning because through decoration. Cray is responsible for the Federal Reserve, which is arguably the most media sort of represented building in America, because every night, if there's an announcement on the news about the Federal Reserve, they show a picture of this building. And so it's probably the most represented building, built in 1937. Now, the Federal Reserve is a very serious building. It's about money and government and the economy. So it wouldn't be appropriate to cover it with dollar signs or art. And there's really only one piece of art, and it's the American eagle over the entrance, which tells you basically that this is a federal building. And because it's marble and imposing and has a minimal amount of classicism, the only classical piers are at the front, these sort of Tuscan piers, and there's a little very pedimented entrance, which is the front door. But otherwise, it's very much a stripped classical building. The proportions are classical, the decorations aren't. And the eagle tells you that this is an important federal building. Incidentally, if you look at the eagle, eagle was the work of Sidney Waugh, a sculptor. And if you look at the claws, you can see that Waugh exaggerates the claws, because you see this eagle from 30 feet down. So you don't see it the way we're looking at it. And so he's exaggerating the claws and makes it a pretty aggressive eagle that's sort of looking after our money. Eero Saarinen, who's a very interesting architect because he's a modernist who is really trying to expand modernism. Doesn't always work, but he lived tragically much too short a life, but he did his best to, what he said is that modernism goes from A to B, and he wants to explore the rest of the alphabet. And here's the American Embassy in London, and it also has an eagle at the top, a very different eagle, with huge spread out wings in proportion to the building, because this is a very long building. And also kind of interesting to see that there is actually ornament. This is a modernist building, but he's trying to figure out how to put ornament. And he has these kind of, I don't know what you would call them. There's a kind of frieze at the top. And then between the windows, there's these sort of, I guess they're aluminum metal ornament, which is a way of trying to make ornament that looks like it's not part of the construction, but is somehow gives you a texture there that the building otherwise wouldn't have. Michael Graves, of course, as mentioned earlier today, the Portlandia building. Graves designed a statue to stand there, and the city fathers of Portland said, well, I think we should have a competition for this study. Maybe they just didn't want it all to be just Graves. And there was a competition, and it was won by Ray Caskey. And it's a wonderful sculpture because the competition was for a sculpture for Portlandia, who is the lady with a trident on the seal of the city of Portland. And Caskey had this wonderful notion of not having her standing there holding her trident the way she appears on the seal, but to have her kneeling down and extending a hand, almost welcoming people into this municipal building. So it's classical, but it's completely modern in its conception. A classical building from the 19th century would never have a female figure like this kneeling down, and with this very contemporary, it's almost as if she says, I'm tired of standing here. I just want to come down and welcome you in. Another example from roughly from the 90s, Tom Beebe's Harold Washington Library in Chicago, which has these beautiful acroteria at the top, sculpted also by Ray Caskey. This one showing at the center, showing an owl holding a book. So again, very, very appropriately done for a museum. The owl is the symbol of wisdom. On top of that, she's holding a book, which is, of course, it's a library. It's still full of books. So and yet she's not a stylized owl. This is a kind of almost a real owl. You notice it's not perfectly symmetrical. The book has a leaf kind of folding out. So it's very much a modern interpretation of an old idea. The fourth use of architectural ornament is kind of obvious and yet very important. And that is, it gives you something to look at when you get close to the building. Buildings are, as Corbusier said, masses that we see in light, big masses, big towers, big arches, whatever it is. But when you get close to a building, you don't see the big masses anymore, but you're still looking at the building. One of the limitations of modern buildings is they're very good at the big masses sort of stuff. This is Rem Koolhaas's Seattle Central Library. So you have big shapes and you walk down the street and you can't miss this building. But when you get close to the building on the right, there's not much there. I mean, like most modern buildings, if you get close, there's some bolts, gaskets, caulking. I mean, just sort of mechanical things that maybe an architect is interested in, but the lay person is not interested in looking at how neatly the bolts are laid out. So that is a problem of buildings that get rid of ornament. And I want to show you one building by Bertrand Goodhue, one of the great architects of the late 19th, early 20th century. And this is the Academy of Sciences in Washington, D.C. I used Goodhue's drawing because you can see the whole building and how it's organized. Goodhue was not a classicist. He was the architect who introduced Spanish colonial architecture to California, for instance. He did buildings in Hawaii, which are very different. And he wanted to do something a little more adventurous stylistically, but this was in Washington facing the Lincoln Memorial, which had just been built, and the Commission of Fine Arts, which approved all buildings on the mall, insisted they had to be classical. And so this is his version of classicism, where the proportions, the symmetry, when we look at it from this distance, it's clearly inspired by classical rules of organization. When we get closer to the building, you see the importance of ornament, because the door and the pediment over the door provide detail. They give you something. You arrive at the building and there's something more, something you didn't see from 50 feet away. But the doors, these are sliding doors, so they're open when you enter, when the building is open, otherwise they're closed. And the doors actually show 8 important figures in science. This is the Academy of Sciences, so that's related to the use of the building. And you can see these are very beautiful panels made out of bronze. The reason the color is different, I think they cleaned the doors had turned green, and then they cleaned them up and they turned this bronze color back. But here's Darwin sitting contemplating, I think, what looks like a skull, and there's a lot of ornament around it. It's an interesting thing to look at. It's a thing that a little child could come up and have a whole lesson in famous scientists just from looking at the doors. The final use of ornament is especially and particularly when it's done by an artist, as these doors were. The doors were not designed by Bertrand Goodhue. They were designed by a sculptor, and that introduces a different sensibility into the building. And this is very important because you often hear statements about, isn't it wonderful when an architect designs the furniture and the plates and the knives and forks and the wall hangings and the wallpaper. And we know buildings like this. Antoni Gaudi designed buildings where he designed all the furniture. So did Michael Graves. So did Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe. I think it's actually quite horrible. Imagine living in a house where everything is designed by the same person. It becomes boring. It's too much. Even when it's a great talent like Frank Lloyd Wright, it's too much. There's only one sensibility at work, and you're sort of getting hit over the head by it. Here's a statement by Bertrand Goodhue, and it's rather long, but it's important because it shows the philosophy that he had, and many architects from the early 1900s. I should like to be merely one of 3 people to produce a building. I should like to do the massing and the plan of the building, and then turn it over to a sculptor to do the sculpture work on the building, and turn it over to a painter to do murals or to some other decorations on the surface of the building. So, and this is the sculptor and the painter are not carrying out Goodhue's orders. He's simply saying, here's an area I'd like you to think about how you're going to decorate it. Obviously, this is a collaboration. They discuss it. And Goodhue, like many architects of the early 1900s, worked many times with the same artists. So this was not sort of parachuted in 10% for art, the way we do it today. These were teams that were on the same wavelengths, and they knew what he was doing. He understood what they wanted to do, and you got some really beautiful things as a result. This is the American Academy of Sciences. The Great Hall is a big room in the middle, which originally was where they had public lectures. You have galleries, and then seats were brought in, and so on. But all the work that the vaults and the dome that Goodhue designed is decorated by Hildreth Mayer, who was a young artist that worked with Goodhue on several projects. And you see what I meant about sensibilities. She has a different sensibility. It's not all just Goodhue. It's not like when you go to a Frank Lloyd Wright house and everything in the house is Frank Lloyd Wright. The stained glass windows, the fireplace, murals, even materials that are hanging from the wall or on the table. They're all designed by him, and it's not really better. I think this approach is a really interesting approach. It's not something we do anymore. Whether we're traditionalists, classicists, or modernists, we want to control everything, architects. We want to design everything. It should be according to our lights. And so the idea, for instance, that a Mies van der Rohe could just invite an artist in and do this would be hard to imagine, or even a Michael Graves. So this is an interior of the villa I showed you earlier by Palladio, but when you go inside, you're not just looking at Palladio, you're also looking at Paolo Veronese, because he painted all these murals on the wall. These are very interesting because it has a cruciform room in the center, which is the sala, or the main sort of living space. And there are 4 rooms in the corners, and Palladio needs doors. So the door on the left is a real door. The door on the right is just a painted door. It's only there to balance the architecture. We know that Palladio designed the layout of these interior murals in other buildings. So he probably did in this building. And so he knew that he wanted a door here, and he had a real door on the left, a fake door on the right. But it was up to Veronese to paint, for instance, the sculpted figures in the niches, or the landscapes that you could see through those arches on the left, or in the case of Veronese, this little girl looking out of opening the door. Elsewhere in the room, there's a dome where the people looking down from you at you are actually family members. And I'm not sure if this little girl was a family member or maybe one of the servants' children, but this having more than one sensibility in a building enriches the building immeasurably. A much later example, McKim, Mead and White designed the Boston Public Library. Here's a big blank wall. So this is the ornament filling a wall, but it's also providing meaning because it's a painting called The Muses Welcoming the Genius of Enlightenment, which obviously relates to the use of the library, which is all about knowledge and learning and enlightenment. But imagine what a poor building this would be without the mural. And also what a poor building if McKim himself had just designed some kind of pattern there. This introduces something which doesn't overwhelm the architecture, but it certainly focuses our attention. It also gives us, as I mentioned earlier, something to look at closer up. It's a big blank wall. The room didn't need windows. And so this is both something to look at, meaning, and also architectural sensibility. One of the great tall buildings in New York is the RCA building, mainly designed by Raymond Hood. It's not a classical building. It's not like his early Gothic buildings, very, very abstract. And yet when you look down, when you look close at the entrance, you've got this extremely elaborate entrance designed by Lee Laurie, and the 2 side entrances are the same. So you look up and you see a very abstract kind of architecture. There's some decoration, some ornament in those spandrels under the windows, but it's 60 stories high. Nobody can see at the top of the building, so it really doesn't matter what you put there. You can't see it, but you do see the bottom, and you particularly you see the entrance, which is such an important part of any building. And so Lee Lowry created these wonderful, really elaborate and extravagant, I don't know what you would call them, bas-reliefs, I suppose, which are also strongly colored and really changed the building. Imagine if that wasn't there, this simply becomes a very cold limestone tower. It all changes thanks to that ornament. Rockefeller Center had a whole program of ornament for each building. So these are some of the lower buildings. The building on the right was the British building, and there Lowry, the same sculptor who did the previous slide, has a kind of stylized arms of England. So it's telling you that this is a particular kind of building. The building, it was called, the buildings, there's a French building and an English building. There was an international theme at the Rockefeller Center. I don't know if the contents of the building were enormously different. I think they were at the very beginning. And here's on the left is another bas-relief. This one not related to the building, but showing a bunch of women, the joy of life, it's called. You notice both of them are part of the architecture. We've lost that ability. I would say in modernist and in traditional buildings these days. So if we boast about 10% for art, but the art has to be standing away from the building. It's never part of the building. And it's so much more interesting when it's part of the building. It adds to the architecture. It doesn't take away from it. Again, these were teams of artists who specialized in this work. These were not artists who were sort of brought in and asked to do this and had never done it before. These were people who specialized in public art. Here's Hildreth Mayer again, the woman I showed you who did the inside of the Academy of Sciences. And this is Radio City Music Hall on the other side of Rockefeller Center. And she was commissioned to do these 3 medallions which show dance, music, and I think drama. And they, again, do a bunch of things. They dress up a blank wall. I mean, this is a big theater. There's no need for windows. And yet you have this blank wall right on the street. And so they dress up the wall. They give you something to look at, and they relate, of course, to the function of Radio City Music Hall. And they're beautiful. These are, I think, enameled metal. So that's an important aspect of ornament, is that it has these 5 uses, but the uses, sometimes some types of ornament cover sort of 2 or 3 or 4 of the uses. And I want to finish off with a very small example, but I think a very important one, because it's a very late building that in a way points in a direction for the future. This is not a polemical lecture. I'm really looking at ornament in the way it's been used in the past and how important it was in many buildings. But here's a building from 1940. It's on the campus of the University of Pennsylvania. It was Paul Cray, who would die not too much later, who was the campus architect. It turned out he didn't build many buildings on the campus. It was just a period when there wasn't much construction. He expanded some buildings. He saw through renovations, but he did build this one building. It's a chemistry building, and it's 1940. And so here's Cray, where he's kind of nudging his way towards the international style, because you have ribbon windows, which are certainly not classical. The bottom has a kind of strange sort of pilaster, sculpted pilasters. So it's not simply repeated from top to bottom, but it's clearly, he's moved quite a ways from the Folger Shakespeare Library. If you go to the entrance, this is the entrance on the side of the building. There's not much going on unless you notice that little bas-relief over the door, and it's Donald DeLue, who was a sculptor from Boston, and it's a sculpture of an alchemist, because this is a chemistry building. And so you actually get humor in a gentle sort of way, in I think a much more successful way than what the postmodernists who tried to introduce humor into architecture, and often not with very great results. Here you notice it doesn't actually say chemistry building anywhere. It's telling you it's a chemistry building. It's probably mostly chemists and chemistry students going in, so they probably don't need to know. But this is a kind of funny little thing that makes the entrance more important, just as this Rockefeller Center did. It highlights the entrance, and it tells you something about the building. And in a way, it's a sort of tongue-in-cheek, because obviously chemists are not alchemists, and yet alchemists were, in a way, the first chemists. So it's a kind of interesting, and also it introduces to this rather severe almost international style architecture, except that it's done in limestone and brick. It introduces another sensibility, an artistic sensibility that doesn't undermine the architecture, but it enriches the architecture. So finally, we probably should correct Corbusier in a modest way and say it's the magnificent play of ornamented masses brought together in light. At least that's what it's always been. And I think that's what it could be again. Thank you very much.
Wow. Really was wondering where you were going with this. And I have to say that I really love this. Architecture is a masterly, correct, magnificent play of ornamented masses brought together in light. Yep. I'd say, yeah. And I would like to hand the podium, not the podium, but the scepter, so to speak, at this moment, or whatever you want to call it. What's that thing the conductor uses? Thank you. To Daniel Morales, who is going to help with questions from the audience and keep the conversation going for what really I hope. I have no idea what's coming up. I really don't. And it should also prove to be exciting. Basically a response by traditionalists and others thinking about exactly these issues. Daniel, we want to start answering or fielding questions or
yes, of course.
It from here. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank Mr. Rybczynski for that wonderful lecture. I think the fact that it, as said, it wasn't polemic is the most important point, because people don't walk around thinking about polemics or politics or anything else when they experience their environment. And those are the people really to whom we're most responsible. So I really appreciate the way you laid that out in the humble way we should all be practicing architecture, in my humble opinion. But anyway, from there, I wanted to open it up to anyone who has questions.
There are quite a few questions, I thought, in the chat.
Sorry, I'm not very good at doing this part here.
Mr. Voresh, have you been following the chat window at all?
Yes, I have. So there's one question from you, Dr. Burris. What is the difference between ornament and decoration?
I think it's just two words for the same thing. I mean, it's a question of semantics more than anything else. What I remember, I quoted, I think it was Dr. Johnson, who said that definitions are tricks for pedants. And I agree with that. So I wouldn't get hung up on what the difference between ornament and decoration. Obviously, there's a difference between ornament if you're simply putting, say, a checkerboard on a floor, and ornament if an artist is painting a mural. It's not, but they both have an ornamental aspect, even though one is art and one is ornament, and yet the art ornaments the building. It's like, I don't have them myself, I'm much too old for that, but people who put tattoos on themselves are ornamenting themselves. They're also full of meaning. It's your mother's name or your lover's name or your name or somebody you admire. But you're ornamenting your body. There's no question of that. I see all of these different things as ornamenting buildings in one way or another.
Yeah, I want to add something to that I think you just, the semantic play, having grown up with a father who's a linguist and being caught on the wrong end of that game many a times, is one of the main problems that we have in architecture, that we don't like to think of ourselves as decorators. That's a lesser function, if you will. That's for the people who deal with feelings. We deal with facts. But that's one of the many roles we do. We decorate the public realm with ornament, however you want to do that. So I'm really glad you made that point, because it's one of these hangups that architects have about pleasing the person walking by. Next question.
Thank you. So Phil, if it's okay for you, I would go through the questions in the chat before giving you the stage. All right?
Certainly.
Okay. All right. Hallie asks, in construction today, how can we better argue the importance of ornamentation? A lot of time, it is the first thing to be cut out in the budget. Developers cannot justify the time and the cost, etc.
Well, Palladio had this problem because he would much have preferred to ornament the interior of his buildings with real marble columns and real pilasters and carved entablatures. So in one way, using painting was a strategy just to make it cheaper. I don't know if Paolo Veronese would have been the cheapest artist around, but there are other villas where we don't really know the artist, and it's not a famous artist like Veronese, and it's clear that they're doing it in order to save money. So budgets have always been a problem for architects. And on the other hand, I would say certainly in federal buildings and in courthouses, there is always a budget for art. There's whatever the percentage is. I didn't include, but I didn't have time to include all the examples, but there's a very good example of a building by Tom Beebe, which is a courthouse in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, which has a kind of gallery in the center where you access all the courtrooms. And he engaged a young artist to do about maybe 12 big murals to decorate the walls of that gallery. And the scenes are all scenes from Alabama history. So starting from colonial history, Civil War history, hurricanes that have hit, big fires in Alabama, the sort of political events. There's one which shows the opening of the civil rights, the big civil rights issue where the school had to be opened by U.S. Marshals to allow Black students into the school. And I haven't seen the building, but when I've studied photographs, when people are standing around in this gallery, waiting to go into a trial or waiting for a courtroom to open, that's what they're looking at. They're not looking at the architecture. Architecture isn't that interesting except to architecture students. They're looking at the murals because the murals are part of their history. They're Alabamans, and they're telling you stories about the place where you live. So it kind of shows the power of that art can have. And this was a young artist, not a famous artist, who Beebe introduced, and who was really free. Once they had I suppose the client had to accept the themes that he was going to paint, but it wasn't designed by the architect. It was very much a complement to the architecture, and it works very well. So I don't think it has to be expensive. Obviously, there are places where budgets cut things out, and I agree, often it's like landscaping is the first to go and decor is the first to go. So that does happen. But I think that with ingenuity, there are ways around this.
Thank you. So I would suggest taking one more question for the chat and then handing over the baton to Phil and to Dan. So Chris asks, for you, Professor Rybczynski, is there a specific quality that in your personal view distinguishes excellent architecture, going deeper than the classical versus modernist distinction?
That's an interesting question that I've often asked myself. For me, and I think it varies with different people, but there's two answers to the question. The first answer is that architecture done with a sense of conviction is always better than architecture done sort of half-heartedly. So whether it's Gaudi or Mies van der Rohe, there's a strong sense of conviction on the part of the architect, what they're doing. Then you can go on and say, well, I don't like what they're doing, or it doesn't move me. That's another question. But I think architecture done with conviction is always moving in some way because the person cared about what they were doing. They weren't doing it mechanically. The other question, which I sort of came up, I asked myself at the end of writing the story of architecture, I asked you the question you asked, like, what is a good building? And I think the simplest answer, and it's a kind of Ernest Hemingway answer, is that good architecture makes you feel good. That's all. It makes you feel good. And you know it when you walk into the building. And it might be, it might be the huge cold space of Notre Dame, or it might be walking into the Pantheon and seeing this hole in the top of the dome and all the sunlight coming in. But you feel something. It's not intellectual. I think for me, that's the simplest answer is if it feels good, it's good.
All right.
Not profound, but I think deep down there's a truth in it.
All right. Thank you very much. So I think we will move on to Phil Azarkov and then to Dan with to make a smooth transition to the next segment of the evening.
Oh.
Thank you very much, everybody, for your questions, and sorry if we didn't get to all of them.
Well, my comment would be ditto to everything you said. It certainly guided my career since leaving Penn in 1974, moving to DC. And one of the first buildings I used as inspiration was the Pan American Union and the topical ornament of Mayan glyphs as opposed to Roman motifs. And integrating ornament well orchestrated into a building, I think, strengthens the overall concept of the building. Maybe decoration, which is a drive for everyone. I think we see that in buildings that are zigzagging around because people want the building to be ornamental. So they make the entire massive ornamental, a little bit like a break dancer when they finish and they're still on their head. Some of these buildings are beautiful. There's a place for, I love Frank Gehry's work, but I think there is sort of, you do sometimes see windows checkerboarding around because, well, I have to do something. It's going to be boring otherwise. But they can't bring themselves to figurative ornament or a garland carved around their door or a figure somewhere integrated in a building like an orchestra where people have a part to play and the whole thing comes together. And it's many people's creative talent being orchestrated. I remember somebody asked Luke Hahn if he could be a great pianist. He said, no, but I could be a composer. And you can write a composition as an architect, and then if people play their parts. And I'll stop there.
I do believe we have a question from Christopher Andrews. I thought that it was a pretty good one. Maybe we still want to take that question. Would that be okay, Professor Rybczynski? Another question?
Sure.
Is Chris Andrews here?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm sorry. I thought maybe it was just going to be read from the chat. So I just wondered, Professor, beautiful talk. Thank you so much. And I do think there's something that you kind of danced around, and I just want to understand this clearly. In my mind, ornament actually has a very clear function, and this is one of the things we always talk about. It functions in terms of legibility. You certainly identified that. It shows us what functions buildings serve in the city, and then what, or wherever their environment is. Also, what parts of the building, for example, where is the entrance? It also functions in terms of the logic of construction. We covered the joints between buildings. Moldings are the most obvious example. But I think most importantly, it celebrates the craft of building and provides a place for the craftsmen and the builders to express their craft and sometimes even themselves, as you sort of elaborated with, the murals and other decorations that artists will put on buildings. These are such clear functions. This idea that ornament is not functional is always seemed kind of a little bit absurd to me. Thank you so much for your talk.
Just a comment. I agree with you very much. What interests me so much about the last generation of traditionalists like Goodhue and Cray was that they accepted that the whole building was no longer like Notre Dame Cathedral. It wasn't a huge work of craft. It was industrialized. If you're building a 60-story skyscraper in Manhattan, you're not sending craftsmen up to work on it. But their solution was to sort of concentrate the ornament, as you said, to point at the entrance, so we know where the entrance is. And I think that sort of points to a kind of a solution to how you have craft in a building which isn't really crafted anymore. I mean, crafts play a different role than they did when the whole building was a work of handcraft, basically. So I thought I find that last moment before modernism comes in is in some ways for me the most interesting, because it's the closest. I can relate to Cray and Goodhue. I can't really relate to some of the earlier architects. They're really living in a different age, and I can understand and appreciate what they've done, but it's an almost a different world. Even somebody like McKim, I think he's a figure from another world, whereas Cray and Goodhue, I can sort of understand the world. Their world is closer, although it's now almost 100 years in some cases since they built things. But when you see their buildings being built and you see the steel frame before the limestone and marble goes on, you can understand it as a modern building. It's not an old-fashioned building where craft is important, or not the kind of craft that was valued, several hundred years ago. It's really something else and something kind of familiar. So it seems to me that's almost a place where we could start from in terms of. Anders said something very interesting in his comments earlier, is that we can't stay in place. I mean, Cray understood that too. He understood that the world was a modern world. And even though he was a Beaux-Arts trained architect, he understood that architecture didn't make a lot of sense anymore. But he was trying to use classicism to make sense and to recognize that every generation of architects wants to do something new. We're all creative people, and creative people don't want to stand still. Whether you're Michelangelo or Bertrand Goodhue, you want to push the envelope a little bit further. And I think that is an important point, both for architects, but also for the public. The public likes new things too.
I agree with you entirely. I think one of the big differences between the classical method and the modernist approach is the business that the entire classical method, and you can actually say all of the architectures of all the traditional world, because they did touch on each other historically, especially along that Islamic spine that went all the way from Portugal to Xi'an. They were in dialogue with one another. The buildings, through the people, the buildings reflected an ongoing dialogue. I don't think that there is a dialogue I think that the idea of the star architect and the idea of the genius, which are both romantic ideas, there were no geniuses before 1800. They're a romantic invention. The starving artist and the garret, all those things are actually, they came from German novels. It wasn't like a necessity of any sort. People didn't have to be poor to be an artist. They had people from all walks of life. But the idea of the isolated artist, the working exclusively in their own little idiom, until they become famous or accepted or what have you, make their breakthrough and become a star architect. That's a modernist notion. It didn't happen before. Yeah, okay, so Michelangelo was called Il Divino, and how many others were? 0 or 1. So I think that the idea, community, of a community of thousands of years in conversation and in creating innovation within that community is maybe a far more potent thing than each inventor sitting in his lab waiting to be adopted by their, by the press, basically, these days. I don't know. I don't have answers. I just have questions. I think we're going to continue this thing, and I'm inviting you to stay around, please, for this if you find it interesting. We're going to have Dan Morales, David Andriazzi, maybe in a car, Elizabeth McNicholas, Matthew McNicholas, and Phil Esikoff, and whoever else wants to join in. Please, you are warmly invited to respond, talk. Consider yourself in the salon we described earlier. You're all in the beauty salon now. I'm handing it over to Dan. Please tell Mr. Cantor that you're ready.
I'm ready if everyone is okay with continuing.
Perfect.
So I'll share my screen here. So I'm just going to give a quick talk about building on the things that we've just heard, the importance of ornament, and then just open it up to a discussion, hopefully. So the 3 components of a good building, as outlined by Vitruvius, are as valid today as they were in his time.
Daniel, we can't see your screen.
Oh, my bad. Oh, I forgot to hit the share button. There you go. Is that working?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, sorry. But while architecture is both an art and a science, it's the art which tends to engage people. That's because beauty is a feeling which draws us in before we can think. To paraphrase the neurologist Antonio Damasio, we are not thinking machines who feel, but rather feeling beings who think. Most people don't notice their surroundings unless it affects them positively or negatively. And like our social interactions, it's often the little things which catch our eye. While whether an architect applies ornament to their building or composes its parts ornamentally, they're communicating an intention to please the viewer. Conversely, buildings with no ornament or sense of composition appear cold and unwelcoming. Studies have shown that blank buildings exact an emotional toll similar to the psychic one we feel when being ignored. The word for ornament in ancient Greece was cosmos, which came from the word to order or arrange. This is also where we get the word cosmetics, from the French cosmétique, meaning to beautify. The other Greek word that's important for the traditional understanding of beauty is harmos, meaning to join together. Therefore, the more harmoniously composed, the more beauty one feels. This is also why modernism rejected ornament. It seemed more rational to talk about practical matters than how a building made one feel. Thanks to our modern education, many architects still view ornament as having little to do with serious or real architecture. The Greeks believed the universe or cosmos was created from elements which swirled around in chaos until harmoniously ordered by their gods. How else to explain the feeling of beauty in a world of chaos? According to the philosopher Pythagoras, the planets emitted a unique vibration based on their orbital revolutions, which together created a harmony similar to the pleasure we feel today when listening to music. That's what he explained. Science has recently shown that this feeling comes from our need for order to survive. Humans evolved to take pleasure from making sense of our surroundings. The quicker, the better. The pleasure we feel is a product of the hormone oxytocin, which is related to altruistic behavior. Recent studies have shown that people who experienced more beauty in the world were more generous to strangers, which helps explain why we are attracted to places with which we have no cultural reference. Therefore, beauty is about more than just ordered geometry. It's also about the intention to please other people. Whether experiencing an act of kindness, discovering the truth, or admiring a bountiful landscape, we are drawn to the things which promote our well-being. As the environmental biologist E.O. Wilson put it, beauty is our word for the qualities that have contributed most to human survival. Nevertheless, this intention to please is best expressed by the same geometric patterns found in nature. Neurologists recently discovered that the brain is most aroused by patterns which have a 20% redundancy of elements, similar to a well-composed traditional building. While we all crave the stimulus of variety, this average is the mean between minimalist simplicity and expressionist complexity. In other words, the pleasure one feels contemplating the beauty of the cosmos is in direct contrast to the discomfort felt in chaos. The two are dependent on each other, thus the classical definition of beauty as a balance between order and disorder, or a unity within variety. This definition remained constant from antiquity until the 20th century, when architecture schools adopted modernism. Beauty, as commonly understood, was deemed obsolete, along with traditional styles and the notion of applied ornament. Modernists believed that man had entered a new age, a machine age to be exact, similar to the inform age we are being sold today. The problem with these labels is that they ignore human nature, which has remained the same for thousands of years. Modernism's rejection of ornament is based on the idea that humans evolved in tandem with technology. Therefore, buildings ought to be designed the way the engineer might design a machine. As Adolf Loos, the first architect to call for the abolition of ornament, said, "The evolution of culture is synonymous with the removal of ornament from objects of daily use." The root of modernism's issue with ornament goes back to the Industrial Revolution and the commercialization of architecture. The sudden growth of cities meant that there were more building types required and more opinions to cater to. Thanks to a growing middle class, architectural patronage went from the few to the many. At the same time, globalization introduced a variety of styles to choose from. The democratization of taste produced a considerable amount of anxiety among those who prided themselves connoisseurs. With the rise of stylistic pluralism, they believed public taste was no longer a sufficient rationale for such a noble profession. With the elevation of science, some opted for a rationalist ideology, while others embraced a more moralistic point of view. But whatever their logic, they all claimed the mantle of truth. The parade of revivals made it seem that style was nothing more than a fashionable garment concealing the science of building. But while they debated, most architects simply took advantage of the widening palette. Artifice has always been part of the architect's toolkit, which is why they used to be called artificers. Even with real materials, the question of which style bedeviled these self-appointed reformers. But in a globalized world, why should there be only one style? As the 19th century philosopher Stendhal wrote, there are as many styles of beauty as there are visions of happiness. Whatever theories one employs, the public is either going to be delighted, indifferent, or turned off by what we design. Adolf Loos once said that the house does not have anything to tell the exterior. Quite the opposite. Humans instinctively read each other, first emotionally and then rationally. Architects who ignore this fact will always have a hard time connecting to the public. Something the 12th century monk Bernard of Clairvaux understood when he wrote, "Since the devotion of the cardinal populace cannot be incited with spiritual ornaments, it is necessary to employ material ones. While science has shown ornament is good for our well-being, let's look at the many ways it engages the public. Maybe then we can lure architecture schools back to the human age where we've all lived for thousands of years." The main reason to ornament a building is to delight the passerby. Regardless of one's culture, level of education, people are attracted to harmoniously composed patterns of light and shade. Ornament humanizes architecture, so we can appreciate it at different scales while not feeling insignificant. As Vitruvius put it, the eye is always in search of beauty. We instinctively look for threats in our environment. Therefore, the most convincing ornament tells the story about how a building works. Take the classical column, whose emphasis is an expression of its load-bearing function, or a cornice, which is an elaboration of a roof's function to shed water. The same is true of the Gothic arch, the flying buttress, and the flying buttress, which started as structural necessities. Over time, these elements became conventionalized into the styles we recognize today. The quality of ornament has always been a reflection of the owner's wealth, a builder's skill, and the architect's eye. In other words, ornaments communicate social status as well. As Vitruvius said, when it appears that a work has been carried out sumptuously, the owner will be the person praised, when delicately, the master workman. But when the proportions lend it an imposing effect, the glory will belong to the architect. This was a bad thing, according to modernists who believed capitalism was the root of all evil. By getting rid of ornament, they hoped architecture would engineer a classless society. Ornaments can convey useful information too about a building's use, location, or history. Even when converted to another use, historic buildings are pleasant reminders of the passage of time. Modernists believe this was pure nostalgia, but imagine throwing out all one's photo albums. As psychologists will tell you, our identity is a construct of the stories we tell each other. Without these reminders, we feel isolated and adrift. This is the same thing dictators do when banning books or stripping a local population of their culture and history. Ornaments also enhance pride of place by adding to the community's visual coherence. When an architect employs local traditions, they are extending the visual harmony of the whole. Given the need to add density in many historic neighborhoods, it's especially baffling that we don't train students to work sensitively within these communities. As the National Trust for Historic Preservation said at its founding in 1965, the real value of a building to a community lies in its being a delight to the eye and its susceptibility to human use. Lastly, a building can be a civic ornament. This works best when a building is isolated, but like a social gathering, there could only be so many characters before the whole party becomes chaotic. For example, a structural building might be beautiful on its own, but in a typical street is jarring. Conversely, a humble building that might seem worthless on its own, but in a larger context plays the role of securing beauty of the street and the overall neighborhood. This is especially true for the average building on a budget. The judicious handling of ornament or composition goes a long way to ensuring that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Whatever an ornament might signal, the most important is the fact that someone cared enough to design something you might find beautiful. This is the ultimate rationale, or whatever reasoning one needs to show kindness to their fellow human being. As the late Henry Hope Reed said, "Man does not build for himself alone, any more than he smiles for himself alone. The facade is designed out of respect to the beholder, a form of architectural courtesy to the man on the street." So that's it.
Well, you have a whole team there of folks who are ready to respond, think, comment, say really brilliant stuff. Where's Alexandros as well? That is wonderful. I'm glad to see you here. Thank you for being here. Where do you want to take the guys? Thank you for your statement. My big deal personally is that I'd like to see us bridging the thinking. I think that Professor Rybczynski has reached out. You know, he's thrown a plank across the alley. I think we should, you know, this is a rooftop to rooftop. We ought to walk in his direction and see, you know, how you know, how do we connect the sensibilities?
I'm happy to jump in if nobody else has anything to start with.
Thank you, Matt.
I thought both of those presentations were fantastic. I'm a bit of a fanatic myself about ornament. I am sad to say that many of the photos that came across in Dan's presentation happened to show Chicago with, and especially in that modernist slide. So this city's done a lot to, like, sadly, you know, make people think it's okay to strip ornament from buildings. But hopefully my backdrop here, the Auditorium Theater here in Chicago, and a few of the images from Professor Rybczynski's presentation, like Raymond Caskey's owls on the Washington Memorial Library, will go a bit of a way to counter that notion that Chicago is responsible. But Dan, you mentioned feeling a number of times, and it's true, right? You know, buildings make us feel a certain way. We don't experience the world cognitively first. We experience it emotionally first, right? And the emotional brain is the oldest part of the brain. It's the limbic system. Right. And as a consequence, it's where all of our sensory input is first processed, right? It's through that base brain, that emotional brain. And emotion is that great kind of viscous clutch, to paraphrase a neuroscientist I know. And it's the thing that kind of separates us from the rest of the animal world. But really, our brain prioritizes its emotional response instantaneously and subconsciously and doles out neurotransmitters and other hormones in response to the stimuli, right? So we don't control these responses consciously. They happen because of our neurological structure and the heuristics that have developed in humans over our evolution, right? A heuristic, of course, being that kind of mental shortcut to prevent cognitive overload. But I'd like to touch a little bit on one of the images that Professor Rybczynski shared with regard to orders, because I think, in traditional groups, we don't often necessarily, at least I haven't experienced that, where people consider the order as ornament in particular. Maybe a capital is ornament, or sculpture in a pediment, or that kind of thing, but not the ornament, not the orders themselves, right? And I think we ought not to forget that the orders in particular, and it just doesn't, I'm not talking about just classical or the Greco-Roman classical. I'm talking about any tradition, really, any traditional architecture that orders its syntax. It structures it in the same way that nature does, which in turn generates a response from us neurologically and consequently physiologically. We get this cascade of hormones, neurotransmitters, neuromodulators, adrenaline, noradrenaline, endorphins, glutamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin. All these things are doled out in our system based on what we're seeing, and that structure that nature shows to us in a fractal way. Right. So we respond to this sort of fractal breakdown of buildings via an order or via an ornament in the same way that we respond to nature. And the right dosage of the right hormones will have great benefit to us. It facilitates homeostasis. It regulates our blood pressure, relaxes our bronchi. It even relieves nasal congestion. But the wrong dosages of hormones that I think you touched on will have a detrimental effect. It increases blood pressure. It constricts arteries, it increases adrenaline and consequently cortisol. And all of this happens without our direct conscious control. So effectively, ornament and via its fractal qualities can regulate or dysregulate our hormonal response, right? And this can have a huge effect on humans, because science has shown that the environment can actually change our gene expression, built environment. And those genes are then passed on to future generations, and the epigenetic effect can be substantial. So Churchill really wasn't wrong when he said, first we shape our buildings and then they shape us, but maybe it was slightly incomplete in that, the presence and quality of ornamental detail, or the complete lack of it, will shape us. And then we share that with future generations.
I think that what Matt said is super essential. The separation of ornament from structure was a 19th century, Zemper wrote the book where he said that it was the dress of the building. That was really the first time it came up. And that separation, I'm not sure exactly where it originated or why it happened, but likely being pushed by industrial sensibilities where different processes started being separated out and different trades being separated out for efficiency. But that's just a guess.
Here, can I respond to that?
Please. Yeah, take it away.
I think that's a romanticization in reverse. In other words, if humans really have always been the same, which is what science confirms, why wouldn't they have done that in the past? And of course, when you do look at the marble cladding and the applied ornament and the false, frill work of certain Gothic buildings, I mean, you see the exact same thing throughout. I think it's really just a product of the amount and speed and consumption of ornament that made people uncomfortable. So in other words, they used, the way we're debating AI, the tools of steel and all these kind of engineering aspects, while still wanting to, please the public. And then seeing this sort of split further sort of accentuated by, the masonry skin and a steel beam. Yeah, it led people to worry, but why did they worry? Well, in part, I think it's just the pluralism that without one style, classical being sort of the Bible, without that Bible, people look for another set of rules. And it's no coincidence that that's when you see rationalism, romanticism, Durand and his grid, and, everyone, meanwhile, the French guy was, De Quincey was saying, no, hold on to the old rules. That's what gives us order. That's how I can tell the rich from the poor. So I think it's a bit of a romanticization to think of, the Gothic builder, feeling his way through everything. I think, but anyway.
I think that I don't really understand where we differ. What I was trying to say was that I agree. It's been done the same always. And within
Yeah.
the various and sundry traditional, I'm saying the whole world, they're basically trying to do the same thing, which is make something appealing to people. And we do know today that that's all measurable neuroscientifically. But the idea of separating out the ornament from the structure, the Bekleidung, which is what Zemper called it in the 1820s. And then that's exactly what's his name? Otto Wagner, I'm somehow related to him. What he did in the Majolica house, it was really just a dress. He painted a dress and stuck it on. The classical method is actually holistic. It understands that we need those shapes for human well-being, that for the brain balance and all those good things that Matt started talking about, those are actually real things that are necessary for human well-being. They're measurable. We know exactly how they work now. They are the only way to actually approach them is by understanding them. It's like music. If you can't read notes, you won't know what's in the symphony. You have to be architecturally literate, know the orders, and because this is a hand-eye brain activity, the only way to learn it is by actually drawing it. But once you've drawn it, you have it. It's like learning to walk or learning to read. You can't not do it and think you have.
Well, I respectfully disagree, only because, in the Renaissance, they would paint, or as the Professor Rybczynski pointed out, they would apply ornament any way they could. And the question about whether you have to draw the orders, obviously, Montgomery Schuyler is one of the leading, he was one of the leading architectural critics in the Architectural Record, a periodical which began in 1893. And he said really the importance of drawing the orders was to learn the sense of proportion to create something beautiful, not for any style, whether it be historic or not. So the point is, why would a carpenter from Chicago, grabbing a bunch of pattern books that he saved up on, looking at a couple of images, be able to produce something that I might walk down the street? And by the way, Matt, Chicago is amazing. I mean, it is mind-boggling. And just as a side note, I've seen more new work, not even specifically historicist, and I told your wife about this, that's absolutely stunning. I travel around and I always take pictures, and 99% are old buildings. In Chicago, 10% of what I took were new buildings. So I don't know what's happening there, but something's happening right, from the developers. But all I'm trying to say is that if it is innate, if I watch my daughter as a 5-year-old child drawing something that has pattern, rhythm, ornament, it's clear, it's clear that it's innate. So yes, drawing the orders gets you literate in the Western tradition. But let me tell you, rocking the south side of Chicago on those days when it's cold or, safe, and you'll see some blocks that aren't directly from Palladio's notebook and blow your mind.
I'm happy to hear you say that, Dan.
Oh man,
we have people with their hands up for some time now, and I would like to ask anybody else who has a question to also put their hands up so we can see you and address. I'd like to call on Alexandros, please. Alexandros Lavdas.
Thank you.
How are you feeling? First of all, how are you feeling?
No fever, so that's okay. That's good. If you can understand what I'm saying, that's good.
You should draw an order. You'll feel better right away.
So thank
Draw
you.
two and call me in the morning.
So I think all this that was said, I think it stresses the fact that even for people who feel so attached to the doctrine of functionalism, they should start respecting ornament, because ornament does have a function. The function of the ornament is deeply ingrained in our nature, and that's not a theory. That's a scientific fact. There's no doubt about it. The other thing that I sometimes like to discuss at this point is that some people react to this whole rationale from a different point of view. The late Roger Scruton was not a fan of neuroaesthetics, and I wish I could have spoken to him, because he was saying we don't need brain scans to show us what we like. Our experience is something that is lived, and it cannot be described or replaced by scans. this is absolutely true, but now this is the age where we have to prove everything all over again. So 150 years ago, that would be completely unnecessary. But now that for the last century, modernism is claiming to be the product of scientific progress and the latest apex of human achievement, I think we need this approach to simply show that this attitude is wrong, not to replace our experience, but to just ground it in science, the same, well, in real science as opposed to pseudoscience, as it happens with modernism. And a final thing I would like to add is that I find it interesting that because people have this innate tendency for ornament, sometimes you see people adding stuff to their houses when they renovate them. I mean, they become a pastiche. It's not interesting, but it just shows that people who have no training and maybe they've lost touch with the aesthetics of the older architecture want to do something, and the result maybe not be beautiful, but it speaks of an inner need. So yeah, that's it for me. Thank you.
Here, I'm gonna just share this image here. I don't know if you can see it, but this was one of the images I showed, which says exactly what you said. And there's many examples of, Corbusiers' idea of how modern man was gonna be happily ever after in this horrific looking thing on the left, and then left to their own devices, Mr. and Mrs. Smith say, no, thank you. I want this to look like something. And to Anne Sussman's point, they ended up making a face out of it, but it's not just a face. You need privacy. You want to modulate the light. There's all sorts of reasons why you would have a human proportioned window. It's not just the load bearing walls need to be broken up ever so much, but it's a reflection of us, which is what we're always doing, projecting ourselves onto everything around us, including each other.
I think I'd add to that there is no society that ever existed that didn't have some kind of ornamentation that wasn't bodily ornament, right? Every society that's ever been documented has some kind of, ornament that they've added to structure or to tools or to pottery, etc. Right? It's an innate human condition. The reality is, like, we put people in unornamented spaces when we want to punish them, called jail cells, right? Like there's no such thing that exists as someone's home that has no detail. They put up even little trinkets around that have meaning to them, etc. So it's just part of our human condition. And I think, if I can just touch on real quick a question earlier on, like, how do we keep ornament in a project? This is one of my one of the things I work on weekly. And that's really, I think, if I can answer that real quick, just to say, we need to make it have meaning to the client or to the owner. That'll make it very hard for them to eliminate despite the cost. But we also need to demonstrate its return on investment, and that's through the science. That's through the value to the project. The attraction of the layperson, visibility in the neighborhood, etc. Because as I say, no one keeps themselves in a Spartan condition. We all love beautiful things, and we like it when we have a pride of place, when our neighborhood looks good, when we live in a building that's beautiful. And that's that may be hard to quantify for a developer, but it's true. It's real.
Thank you very much, Matt. Chris.
Yes, thank you. I've just been listening with interest again to this presentation, and
we can't see you.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm on the road.
Thank you.
I'm in a rather unornamented hotel room. So, but in any case, yeah, I want to thank Witold Rybczynski for the points he made, and I detected a thread of kind of an objective truth in there, that it when you see it. We know what's good and what's beautiful when we see it, and also reflect on Andres Duani and his optimism, because I'm part of the younger generation where I didn't experience the same. I was fortunate to be in a sheltered place where I could learn classicism and traditionalism openly. So I don't, when I see the mainstream today, I think what I want to ask about, or just put a thought out there, is what challenges are coming next to this community, and how do we articulate what we stand for? I know it's going to be individual to everyone, but the theme that seems to come up for me is the role of the person, of humans, and this idea that we're always trying to reinvent our nature, or thinking we can willfully change human nature through innovation. And I think maybe what helps me stay grounded is a belief that human nature is what it is, and we need to respect it. And we need to celebrate it like the Greeks would do, rather than persecuting it. The other point would be, just seeing how the mainstream has started to adopt vernacular architecture, regionalism, as a sort of emerging accepted, not a fad, I would say, but it certainly ties in with sustainability for them. I worry that if we approach the mainstream and we criticize them when we're kind of going in guns blazing, ready for a fight, kind of ready to be attacked, it may confuse them, and it may play into some people's hands a bit, where it's like, well, what are we fighting about? We're already doing this. So where is it going? Sorry for rambling a bit, but I'm curious on people's thoughts, and maybe we can save this for later, about what I see as a potential conflict coming up that we don't want to be on the wrong side of, which is the preservation of modernist buildings. That distinction of what do we preserve, what is worthy of preservation. How do we make that distinction when we can no longer use the term modernism to distinguish ourselves from it? Because I think that kind of plays into the hands of our opponents too. I mean, a word like modernism is not inherently negative, at least to me. It could almost be spun as more relevant. So, getting to the root of how do we distinguish good, humane, beneficial, beautiful architecture, that in a way that we can justify in a broader sense, when it comes to that upcoming battle over what do we preserve.
I think those are good points. And I would like to point out that I personally do not believe in any opposition in the art world. The people who oppose to traditional design are modernists. I don't think that a good traditionalist would ever oppose to any style whatsoever. I think that we all recognize there's an appropriateness to styles, and that you wouldn't want to see Falling Water in any other style. You wouldn't want to see Wayfarer's Chapel in any other style. You wouldn't want to see Rockefeller Center in any other style, whether you consider it modernist or you consider it traditionalist. I think that there's place for all, and it's about the appropriateness of it. I think we all recognize that one size does not fit all. And also, I think we recognize that the different styles have different attributes to them, much like the instruments in an orchestra. You can't have an orchestra without all the instruments, including some that really you can't play it over all the music, like the gong, cymbals. So that said, Mr. Esikoff, who is the cause for this whole discussion and session, we started talking about a year ago, and the idea came up that buildings ought to last for a long time and be made to do so. And the question then, of course, is, well, for how long and such? And that took us to the idea of having architecture awards for buildings that are going to look good in 50 years. And we did not get a single modernist entry.
Yes, I'm sorry I didn't have time to do that, but let me just say, I actually talked to several people who are preservation architects, preservation architectural historians about preservation process. And having taken almost every single project I've done through either the Commission of Fine Arts in Washington, the Historic Preservation Review Board, or the various Office of Planning regimes, plan unit developments, I really wanted to say that the Historic Preservation Review Board doesn't say it's the Architectural Preservation Review Board. It's the Historic Preservation Review Board, because our buildings are artifacts of history. And I'd like to think that if I'm designing a building in a historic district, that people will say, we should extend the period of significance of this district, because this great-grandchild of these other buildings that are landmarks of this district is worthy of being included in a broader, longer definition of the epic of human events. That it's the footprint of a new dinosaur. That this is a building that had cavity wall, but it was so beautifully detailed with tells that there are certain little details, certain little pieces of ornament that we're trying to bring water out from that cavity, or that it's a cast stone cornice that couldn't be hand carved, could only be molded in the same way that terracotta, which we consider historic, was molded, but there's a giveaway in every little thing, that every little metal ornament could only have been accomplished either with a water jet or laser cut and folding system. That would make it something that the grandparents or great-grandparents, the architects in our neighborhood in, say, Kalorama Triangle and Sheridan Kalorama Historic District, and we're sort of like on the cusp there with our Chinese embassy project, that they would say, you did pretty good. I wouldn't have thought of that. You obviously saw what I did and then made it your own and then stole it. And then it's not me, because I know that James Joyce read all of Shakespeare, but he didn't write a Shakespearean play. And Shakespeare probably would have liked what he wrote. And so that's what I'm thinking when Professor Rybczynski talked about we all want to be expressive and move on. I don't think we want to move on ignorant of history or ungrounded or unfounded in it. I'll stop there. Or do you agree, Professor? Is he still here?
Professor, is the professor still here?
He was a second ago.
You might have just stepped away.
Well, we're looking for Matt. One way of selling ornament is that in some of our zoning cases, we were able to add 2 floors to a building, but we needed to do that in the context of a building that was as beautiful as its surroundings and worthy of being taller. That wasn't imposition; it was a delight to look at, and they wanted more of it, not less of it. And so that's something that then the developer says, "Wow, 2 more floors at the top of the building yields a far more money, far more than the 2 or 3% the budget that a beautiful piece of carved or molded or polychrome decoration will."
That's fantastic.
Wow.
Similarly, we got a 65-foot parking structure in a residential neighborhood, so an extra 30 feet on the structure, 9 feet closer to the road, because we did it as a collegiate Gothic structure rather than as just an ugly, concrete structure. So it does a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, that reminds me of a project I worked on in Old Town, where it was a half a block, and the firm I was working for, they were agnostic somewhat, but in their heart they were modernist, as their educations taught them to be. And so my boss kept telling me to design something that was glass and and all this. And we kept getting shut down at the citizens board, and the way they'd arranged it in the historic district is needed that approval to move on through the system.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we kept getting slammed. And so he said, make it a bit more traditional. So I made it kind of like a stripped down classical. And then the next meeting, someone's like, that looks like Stalinism. And, and so in the meantime, we're about to lose the job. And in other words, architecture being a business, you have to eat, you have to do something that works. So he knew that I was, they used to call me 19th century boy. So he knew I liked to play with pastry, or as they used to decry. And so they said, all right, Dan, just go ahead and, give it a go, do whatever you can. And so I said, fine. He said, give it a go, do whatever I can. So it was basically an apartment building. And I did what a lot of you guys have done with these great projects. I just broke it up into a story, the central block being the old Georgian that was set back, and then a couple of other pieces. And of course, it was all held together floor wise and all that, but you play with all the elements. And so we presented that, and it got built, and so there's countless stories like this. If you give something to people back, they will in turn give you a bit more square foot or the right to build. And that's sort of this unspoken, contract between the fact that an architect should do no harm. Yes, but we should also do some good, and there is a recompense for it.
Well, the other thing that I found very satisfying in our office too was that like one of the quotes that the professor had up there was, there were always people in the office who you could assign to work on various ornamental parts of the building. And so you had that opportunity to collaborate with them or bring out their artistic talent, even if they've only been out of school for 2 years. They do know how to hold a pencil, and they do know how to look at things and describe them. And so I think that made it much more satisfying to people. And a lot of times these ornamental programs were reserved as inscription here on the working drawings. So they were in the budget. And then when we got the drawings from the subcontractors, we then added what that artwork would be so that we could meet our schedule, but then also make life a little more fun for people at the check shop drawing.
There's a conversation about mine in the chat. If anybody wants to take that on, really excited about everything that we have been doing here. I think we are in a position to open up for a final round. I think where we're heading is that the idea of so-called ornament, I don't even know how to qualify it exactly, other than it is part of, it's an essential integral part of the actual architecture. The orders themselves, each one of the single element orders entirely are composed of only 8 little shapes. If you actually have gone through training and you're architecturally literate, you'll know that only 8 shapes make up all the architecture of all the world. And that these 8 shapes, when they are in a certain order, you recognize it as something that the brain actually reads as having meaning. If you take out an element and put it somewhere else, it's like taking a letter out of a word. And it loses the meaning for the brain. And that's much of what postmodernism did. The idea that we have a basic shape, every traditionalist knows that every shape can be embellished. So you can take an ovalo, which is basically wannabe a quarter circle or a quarter ellipse, and you can embellish it into an egg and dart. You can embellish a cyma into a water leaf. You can embellish. And how do we know when to do that? Based on appropriateness. Sometimes it could be the wealth of the client. Usually that's a symbol of nouveau riche. But it can also be based on the appropriateness in the urban context. It can be appropriateness based on what form follows function, what the building is. Is it a library? Is it a bank? Is it a home? Is it a train station? They each are recognizable different types of buildings, and you can embellish the elements of the order however you want to, based on what is your sense of appropriateness. And that sense of appropriateness is very similar to any sense of appropriateness in any human interaction. Don't chew glass and don't pee on the carpet. Do the right thing, and people will listen to you and will love what you're proposing. And this is a system. I'm not sure. I don't know how it exactly evolved, but it evolved in Greece, and it evolved in Greece with 2 things happening there. Number one, they believed that they could reason through anything. And reason is not rationalism. Any ism is a poor facsimile of the original. Reasoning is simply sitting down and figuring something out in conversation with others until everybody's satisfied. That was their method. And they concluded that truth, goodness, and beauty are a unity. And then they did this great experiment, the Parthenon. Very quickly, once these concepts, now we know that the concept of firmness, commodity, delight actually appeared in ancient Egyptian stuff. I don't want to get into that right now. But these ideas have been floating around for a long time. And I guarantee that these ideas exist in very primitive cultures, not primitive, but however you want to call them, other cultures, very exotic cultures throughout the world in some form or fashion. So these guys believed that they could talk through anything, come to a reasonable understanding. And some of them hit the nails very, right on the head with science 2,000 years later 2,500 years, however long later, validating the reasoning in many cases. Some of it didn't work, like the Ptolemaic sphere business of the stars and the moon, the planets, all that stuff, the astronomy bit. But other parts did work very well. And the parts that relate to the built environment have never been improved upon. We have had fantastic discourse in the last 2,500 years, going through the Muslim, the Islamic mill, going through all the way to the impact on the way back coming from China and India, through the Silk Roads and everything else. So that you have in Venice one of the churches with the spires. They look like Turkish cones. It's not by accident. There was a back and forth and a give and take throughout antiquity that we simply don't know about because we've been led to believe that it didn't. Antiquity, the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, the whole 9 yards. People knew about each other. People knew about what was going on. Vitruvius was read consistently throughout history. It wasn't lost and reclaimed. And that communication was of a very high quality, especially in mathematics and philosophy and also in construction. So there were other aspects in the culture then, the cultures that between the ancients and today, that and the Renaissance, who wanted to do things in the manner of the ancients while they were actually living a day-to-day life that was completely medieval. But they wanted to do in the manner of the ancients. I believe that the manner of the ancients really is in the spirit of the idea of the understanding, the basic philosophy that underpins what we need to do for the built environment, for the improvement of the individual lot and the societal lot, as proven by all the types of science, yada, 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 yada. It all is one big, beautiful story. It's our story as human beings. So I want to, like John Massillon said, we're all connected. Quantum physics says, and yes, he's talking about the mind as the Greeks did. Does anybody recall on the Oracle in Delphi, one of the more ridiculous institutions in the universe ever, what it had carved on the wall when you went to ask the priestesses who were high on ethylene some question very crucial in your life? And by the way, when they were on vacation, they sent them to vacation because breathing ethylene is not so good for you. So what they had the screen there, and behind the screen were priests, and you could only ask yes or no answers. So for yes answers, they toss a white bean over the screen, and for no answers, they toss a red bean. I mean, I think that's almost as good as ChatGPT, and takes a lot less energy to do it. Anyways, and there are many intelligent people who have written about how we see differently than the Greeks did. I don't know what it means to see. Is he talking about the eye brain, or is he talking about?
So near next year, get Mark Hewitt to speak. He's writing an article about it right now, and other people like Owen Barfield have written about it before.
Okay, well, we'll all read the articles and decide for ourselves if they're really wonderful, great things. Yeah, I really wonder about the seeing, because so much of the seeing comes on a cultural bed. As a modernist, I was trained not to see traditional architecture. I was trained not to see beauty.
Near this guy Gideon, I don't know if his first name is Siegfried.
Siegfried.
He was brought over to Harvard by Gropius and basically charged with writing the history of modernism, a movement that was supposed to be against modernism, against history. But of course, once you root it in, you're more justified. And he used this sort of that parlor trick of, now we're seeing differently thanks to machines and this and that and the other, talking about this fourth thing of space. Now we're seeing space because there's the dumb idea that there's a bunch of glass and all of a sudden you can see through and it's not walls. I can still see a glass wall. They still build the glass curtain wall in 1913 as a office building in San Francisco. And I can guarantee no one was seeing anything different except the usual reflections on the opposite side. Now, whether you see like where I think where you can go beyond this innate visual way of interpreting the world is our associations. We all carry them, we all have them, and that's what makes adding culture and traditional elements more interesting to the people that are there. But that doesn't, but you could have someone completely uneducated, like Alberti said, a building has to be, you know, delightful to the educated and uneducated alike. So if you want to add all those levels of meaning, by all means, I do. You know, Phil did in his wonderful buildings. It's there to be appreciated, but like the monk, the aesthetic monk, you know, Bernard said, who was all about stripping ornament down, and they credit him for, you know, some of the Gothic innovations, you know, that's all debatable. If I can't get him in based on these spiritual ornaments, I'm going to have to use material ones to just get him in the door to, you know, fund the place kind of thing. So this whole idea that we're seeing all differently because of technology and this and that, it's wonderful to believe that you're this unique and special person in this unique and special times. But I think the beauty is that we're all 99.9% similar. It's just the 0.1% that makes it interesting to talk amongst each other, you know.
John,
Daniel, but the idea that I'm talking about technology is the reason why we're seeing is just, it's not what I'm talking about.
Right, but I mean, whatever
I'm
technology
talking
I
about
have,
consciousness. I'm not talking about technology. And I certainly am not saying Siegfried Gideon was right.
I'm not saying you are. I'm just analogous to your idea from this person who's saying we're seeing differently. I've just heard that before. And, you know, they wrote a lot of propaganda to justify what they wanted to do, as most people do. But if you dig deep inside of what the actual debates were, for example, you know, I love collecting old periodicals where you can actually follow the debate between Cram and Raymond Hood and all these people that were debating when modernism was coming in. They were justifying architecture in the exact same way that Alberti, Vitruvius, and everyone else did, because it is innate. So that's the history that they didn't teach you when you went to architecture school. You know, they taught you the Gideon version, the Pevsner version. But I mean, the architectural Society of Architectural Historians, right around 1940, you'll see them talking about the need to rewrite history completely. So they did. And that's the history that they taught. And that's the stuff that we were marinated in for our whole architectural education. You look beyond that to the actual words of the people who lived through that period, you'll identify immediately with the thoughts and feelings that, well, maybe not you, but that a lot of people have had that, you know, about the built environment.
We're talking about very different things, Daniel.
Well then please correct me where I'm wrong. I want to learn from you.
I'm not talking about reacting to modernism. What Siegfried Gideon said is irrelevant to what I'm talking about. Absolutely 100% irrelevant.
I think we're a little bit past responding to Gideon. I think we're in Pevsner's so-called history is completely, it's completely it's a fabrication. It never was like he wrote. Many of the people he considered predecessors of the modern movement asked not to be in his book, and he put them in anyways. But I think that there is a lot of content to go through here. Idea of ornament as being an add-on. Yeah, sometimes you do add it on during construction, like when you put an architrave around a door. But generally speaking, it is conceived of as essential and as part of the whole.
Well, can I say something, Daniel, that treatise presented? Some people, I think, by their nature, you know, how they were brought up, but also maybe by the education they received, when they got out of school, they had a scaffolding, and they used that to continue to educate themselves and build. And I think one of the things that I was struck by Roger's paper that he wrote on traditional architecture is that he had to learn that on his own. And some of us, I think, have continued to look at all these things. I mean, I learned about a lot of this ornament and cray after I left Penn, while I had to take things through the review board here. So I had to keep digging into that. But somehow that idea that you have to keep digging into that, that is as much inspired by Louis Kahn saying, I'm looking for volume 0 of architecture. Where do you start? Let's start over. He didn't say, and let's stop there. He was saying, you start and you keep looking, you keep exploring and looking. And I think that curiosity, some people have it, some people are encouraged to have that when they leave school. And I think the group of people here, just in trying to figure out, well, what is the science behind this? I know I like it, but what is the chemical composition of this food I'm eating? Because it's tasty, but I don't know why. I want to know why scientifically. But that's all I'll say.
Yeah, and then you go back in the kitchen and just cook.
Right.
And I think that most of us just cook and trying to make the world a better place with cooking the right kind of food. Nutritious and tasty food. Delicious. Thank you. Somebody came up with a question and of a really good book suggestion for history in general. And then somebody said Bannister Fletcher. Don't forget Bannister Fletcher. If you need to have it in one volume, I don't see anything wrong with Bannister Fletcher. There have been any number of books on the history of. The thing about the history of is that it comes from its time. So I've never really read Fischer von Erlach, but when I do, I think I might have a much deeper understanding of the human experience than I do right now. Does anybody here, just as a query, does anybody here have an opinion about Will and Ariel Durant's Story of Civilization? Yes, there's a CEU. Where are we getting our little poll? Mr. Cantor, thank you. Thanks for reminding. Yay. Thank you very much to our sponsors, Arbon Precastone, AP Formliner, and Vetterstone, who Phil Esikoff so generously labored to bring them to our community. Thank you very much. Sorry?
I couldn't have done any of these buildings without these guys.
Yeah.
It's a real contribution as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. I think that a genuine architect realizes that the people they work with are as important as they are, if not more.
Yeah.
No composer cannot have his music played without an orchestra.
Right.
And can anyone, the discount code, here's the discount code. You still want the discount code? I recommend the book as a lovely sort of run through the history of architecture, the story. What I found really endearing is that the last paragraph of every chapter includes the word innovative in some conjugation. I don't believe that any real artist is out there with the intention of innovating. They are engaging. I think they understand that they're engaging in a generations-long, millennia-long conversation with all the other artists and producers that came before them and makers, and celebrating themselves and humanity in their particular way, and innovating. That's for another conversation. Are we done? Can we close this fantastic session? I want to thank again the community for your support. Daniel Silva, Jonathan Smith, Elizabeth Platter-Zyber, Bruce Donnelly, Christopher Andrews, Christopher Weeks, James Darty, Abraham Calhoun, Isabella Tinana Diaz, Patrick Westu, Chris Fagan, Sean Perry, James Everett, Beth Dowdle, Ann Daigle, Batul Al-Musawi, Milena Kirklis, Bingri, and David Brusat. Thank you. We could not do this without you. And from some of the best fabric ever built, I want to say adieu. Final comments, final thanks.
Thank you, Nir. Thanks it was wonderful to hear the diversity of voices and and to find the unity within everyone's attempt to make a more humane built environment, whatever their approach is.
Here, here. Here, here.
Thank you for a wonderful meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I want to invite everybody to the Traditional Architecture, Urbanism, and Crafts Council. Contact me directly if you're interested in being a member of that. Especially, I am reaching out to people who are leaders of their own community. I think that Robert Krasser is going to contact you directly for that. And I believe that the idea is that at Poundbury, in Michael Mahaffey's session at Poundbury, we'll have our first gathering of that. And if not, soon thereafter. But I actually like the idea of the beauty salon better. Would anybody like to say a final word or two?
Thank you, Mir. It was a great day. I couldn't be with you yesterday, but it's great to see the breadth of participants, young and old, from apparently all over the globe. So congratulations for that.
It's
wonderful to be with you all.
And thank you to you. Without you, it would never have happened. Period. Thank you. Final closing words. Thank you for being here.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, well, this has been wonderful. I really appreciate you putting this all together, Nir. I mean, like as others have said, the kind of breadth of topic that we've touched on in 3 days and the kind of aspects as they relate to the human experience and architecture and how we can make more humane built environments that that facilitate health and that really inspire people and bring, you know, delight and beauty to their daily lives is important. And so thanks for organizing all this and making it available to everyone.
Catherine says here, send me your money and I will bring them, what is this, for you, and bring them over in October to Poundbury. You want to be our travel agent? That'll be very nice.
No, I was going to buy a book for Emo and Pablo and nobody else.
Oh, I think they sell them in the UK at this point.
That would be sweet, but I think on Amazon in Germany, it's around the same price as you would get with the discount in the US for some reason. So thank you, but I think it is just extra work for you.
I live 20 miles from Yale. I would buy them from the store directly.
Find out before you drive or walk if they are going to give you the discount there. Oh, you have the code. Smart girl. Okay, good. Very good. Very, very good. So organized. We are a great.
Later. Thank you very much, everybody.
We are a great community. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Lucien, thank you again. Alexandros, thank you. Patrick, miss you. Daniel Silva, great to see you here.
This was so amazing. Congratulations. Absolutely beautiful. Really, really wonderful.
I didn't do anything. I just sat in the chair.
Wow, that was so great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to do the next tag in a couple of years this way, unless somebody wants to and somebody's really enthusiastic about doing it. It is a huge amount of work, and our volunteer and staff, they worked in the last 2 weeks. They worked nonstop. It was a very heavy lift. We are seeking sponsorship for the whole thing. It costs about 20-25 grand to run a show like this properly. We got much of that, but not all of it this time. So some of that is a relief. But in the future, I think we need better organization, and inviting you to join us at the CPI and help create more better stuff for people together.
Yeah, I think just, you know, having been part of this for 3 years and just seeing the impact it can have and the level, you know, the quality and the depth of discussions, I really think, and I would like to be part of that, help you to maybe connect to a university to kind of, you know, and also because something I missed really, I haven't seen students from Notre Dame, I haven't seen students from Miami, I haven't seen students from So, and I think it's really, really important that this type of discussions go to, I mean, we have really fantastic young people, but the people I've seen were often people from the summer schools. You know, that was so amazing, the impact the summer schools have on young people, but I haven't seen students even from universities which are very, very favorable to this thinking. So why didn't they come? What's the reason? And I think it would be useful to have this kind of institutional kind of match to reach out, to get a larger, you know, a more efficient reach out to the academic kids, you know.
I think you're right. I think we do need to bring them together. I think they're very busy. I think they see us somewhat competitively at some degree. Maybe, I don't really know. I would like to have that kind of interaction. Liz, maybe you have an idea of how we can make that happen.
Well, I was just going to point out that it's spring break.
Yeah. Also midterm, I think it's midterm reviews at Notre Dame.
They even leave early for spring break.
Yeah. So maybe that's something new. You have to consider a little bit calendars, university calendars.
Well, ideally, I would like to bring people from Miami Catholic, UVU, Notre Dame, and Benedictine together to really make it a common occurrence. But we had to kick it off somehow or other because, you know, why isn't there, you know how many times I've reached out to Peter Leiden from the ICA? I think he's answered once and told me to go talk to somebody else. It's like that. I was very lucky to have a very nice relationship with Mark Wilson from TAG in England, the Reba TAG, Robert Adam, who's been.
Just one thing that does get students' attention is but this is not homework for you because this is already difficult enough what you're doing. But I think the Zoom format does lend itself, and if the organization grows, then doing a design competition for students in the way that you presented the work of professionals at the beginning, awards for students. You could even ask faculty to present, you know, to pick the awards in their school and then just present it here.
I think that's a great idea. Thank you. May I call on you for more advice and direction?
Yeah. I'll tell you how a couple of other organizations have done it.
Also, Neil, I think you should take some of the young leaders and entrust them, you know, just kind of ask them to do the connections, do the networking, because they're really, really good. So they would do it very efficiently because they have been demonstrating in their summer schools. You know, people like Nadia and Pablo, Alejandro, they are really, really, really efficient. And there's, you know, organizations like the Students for Classical Architecture. I've not seen anybody from Students for Classical Architecture. It's a really brilliant organization, very efficient, but there was nobody around. There's students for diversity, there's students for new urbanism. They were not present. So I think that working with the students' organizations which are already sympathetic would be really, really good. And I can give you some names. I know some people, you know, and you talk directly to the people and you will get, they will deliver, you know. But you have to reach out to the, you know, to the leaders, really.
And the ICA has an education director who will return your calls, Near Edith Platten.
Okay,
Oh,
I'll reach out to her. I will reach out to her. Well, I'm glad to hear all that. Thank you very, very much. It could also be that our social media has not been very productive in the last year. We're looking at that at this point. I think we need to improve it. I don't know how to do that. Somebody will figure it out.
Yeah, it was very good, but just too late, because now it has been, this last week, it has been really active, but it should have been active 2 months ago. You see, so it's kind of a little bit, has been a little bit delayed, you know. But
You
it was
know, I have to say that when you and I worked it was really good, and that we should recreate that system. We didn't do it exactly that same way this last year, so maybe there's a system engaged. Thank you all for caring about all this and having it work properly. We do need I don't know, a little bit of a universal platform is what I'm trying to say, not as territorial as some of them have been. And also, I want to thank you for those of you who are going to make it to the actual award ceremony in 2073. We'll see you there.
okay.
In one form or another.
Hasta la vista.
Hasta la vista. You might not see us, but we'll see you.
No, I'll be there. I promise.
It's not that impossible these days.
No, it's not that far away.
Thank you very much.